Yes, there have been differences between America and Europe. No doubt there will be differences in the future. But the burdens of global citizenship continue to bind us together. Partnership and cooperation among nations is not a choice. It is the only way, the one way, to protect our common security and advance our common humanity.
Bretton Woods, a hotel in New Hampshire, was the home to 700 delegates from 44 nations, who, in a 30-day period, were able to overhaul the global monetary system. Although the Marshall Plan is credited for post-World War II European reconstruction, the compromises made at the Bretton Woods Conference, including the system of fixed exchange rates, the International Monetary Fund, and the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, paved the way for a new age of globalization and economic cooperation by ending trade barriers and protectionist policies. This 1944 conference had its roots in the conflicts of the early 20th century.
The Great Depression, a conflict that was triggered by a multitude of factors such as the weak banking infrastructure and the rigid gold standard, and its start was marked by the infamous stock market crash dubbed Black Tuesday. From bank runs to over-speculation to deflation, the entire economic and financial backbone of the United States collapsed. As the unemployment rate skyrocketed and domestic economic issues piled up, many Americans grew resentful of free trade and sought to avoid conflict by protecting their own industry. Republican Representative Willis Hawley and Senator Reed Smoot passed the Smoot-Hawley Tariff, what the United States Senate now calls one of the most catastrophic acts in congressional history.
Now, even if nobody retaliated, that would lead to a dramatic reduction in trade. But countries did retaliate. Places like Britain and France and Germany began to say, well, look, if you won't take our goods, we won't take your goods, so we're going to put tariffs as well.
Thus began the War on Tariffs. Britain retaliated by passing the Import Duties Act in 1932. This tariff ruled that trade within the British Commonwealth would be subject to lower tariffs than trade with nations outside of British rule. The United States fought to end the trade barrier. However, under Chamberlain, Britain refused to repeal this system of imperial preferences until the United States repealed the Hawley-Smoot tariff.
The Great Depression not only led to tariff wars, but also led to competitive currency devaluation. Following the Great Depression, Britain made the bold decision to eliminate the gold standard, and they were soon followed by Sweden, Norway, and other European countries. In the United States, Franklin Delano Roosevelt sought a more flexible monetary policy to stimulate the economy, so he signed the Executive Order 6102 in 1933, which took the United States off of the gold standard. With the abandonment of the gold standard came the abandonment of economic discipline. Inexperienced with uncontrolled exchange rates, countries began to devalue their currencies in order to increase exports.
In particular, what they were concerned about at Bretton Woods was competitive currency devaluations, where during the Depression, different countries at different times would devalue their currency to make their goods cheaper. And there was competitive devaluations because in the end, everybody loses.
Devaluing currency is an effective way of increasing exports. However, when many countries competitively devalue their currency, conflict emerges through weak economic cooperation in world trade. From 1929 to 1934, world trade fell by an unprecedented 66%.
With low economic cooperation and the impending end of World War II, Roosevelt recognized the need for a global conference to solve conflict and create the New World Economic Order.
When the war is winding down, lots of people in the United States and particularly in England too realize, okay, if we don't figure out a way to create some global economic institution or institutions, we're going to be again in the midst of some kind of global conflict.
Over 700 delegates from 44 nations came to the Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire in order to solve the economic issues that plagued the 1930s.
When people talk about Bretton Woods, the two figures that people talk about are White and Keynes. Keynes was a giant. He's probably the most important economist since Adam Smith in terms of his influence.
White was the main delegate representing the United States, and Keynes was the main delegate representing Britain. Through cooperation and compromise, the 44 nations present at the conference came up with a three-part agreement. First, a system of fixed exchange rates. Second, the IMF and World Bank. And lastly, the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs. In this system, all participating currencies would be tied to the dollar at a fixed exchange rate, and the dollar would be tied to gold at $35 an ounce. This arrangement provides more flexibility than the constricting gold standard, while at the same time it is strict enough to prevent competitive currency devaluation.
This is what the French call the extraordinary privilege of the United States. We can buy stuff outside the United States with our currency. The dollar is the international liquidity.
The second part of the agreement was the IMF and World Bank.
Initially, there were two plans proposed. Bretton and Keynes' plan favored deficit countries, but in the end, more the United States and White's plan for the International Monetary Fund was adopted. However, Keynes did succeed in making the IMF bigger than the US initially wanted it to be. The International Monetary Fund helps solve short-term credit imbalances by providing loans to struggling economies, and it helps foster global economic cooperation.
It was an attempt to have cross-border cooperation amongst monetary policy authorities to ensure stability in the global financial and monetary systems.
In addition to the IMF, the World Bank was also created at the conference in order to restore the infrastructure in post-war countries. However, it later shifted its mission to eliminating poverty in developing nations. Through compromise, traditions soon emerged that the United States elects the head of the World Bank and European countries elect the head of the IMF.
Fixed exchange rates helped solve competitive currency devaluation. The IMF and World Bank helped foster global cooperation. And finally, the forgotten leg of the Bretton Woods Agreement. The General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade helped eliminate tariffs and protectionist policies.
Some people would argue that actually the most valuable institutional creation, a way of ending conflict, in Bretton Woods was the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, the GATT, which is now the World Trade Organization. And the GATT had as a very clear objective trying to reduce tariffs worldwide.
Tariffs were a highly debated issue, but the delegates finally reached a compromise at the Geneva Convention shortly after Bretton Woods. Countries agreed to eliminate individual tariffs in order to restore world trade.
The legacy of Bretton Woods lives on through the World Trade Organization, the IMF, and the World Bank. However, in 1971, Nixon ended the system of fixed exchange rates.
I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets.
Even though the fixed exchange rate system was eventually ended, the effects of Bretton Woods cannot be overstated. By interconnecting economies through currency and trade, countries had a vested interest in helping foreign nations grow. Even though countries had to compromise and withdraw their tariffs and protectionist policies, in the end they were positively affected by the increase in cooperation and globalization.
The unprecedented cooperation between nations at the conference was a microcosm for the global cooperation that emerged in the decades following it. World trade was restored and peace was attained. In the face of conflict, these delegates were able to put away their individual interests and compromise to create a new age of globalization.
In an attempt to push the US-centric narrative of world history, we tend to forget about the integral agreements made at Bretton Woods. Because of this narrative and the technical nature of the conference, its true importance is often overlooked.
And initiatives like the Marshall Plan, speeches like the Truman Doctrine, episodes like the Berlin Airlift, all contributed to that narrative much more clearly than episodes like the Bretton Woods Conference, which seemed kind of technical, were technical, and therefore less dramatic.
We have breaking news that President Trump will withdraw from the France agreements with respect to global warming.
Due to the revival of isolationism in modern politics, the lessons of global cooperation and compromise learned at Bretton Woods are more important now than ever before.
The Bretton Woods agreements create a more efficient world,
a more connected world,
a more cooperative world,
and a more globalized world.